Andrew Clapham is going to come up and talk to us now about migration. There are some scary numbers around about what climate change might do to people and put them on the move. He runs the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights.
Thank you very much. Our working group was called International Law and Climate Displaced People. And on the first day, Kofi Annan had told us in the plenary that international law does not protect climate displaced persons. And a few minutes later, Walter Fust followed up by pointing out that if you ask two lawyers for an opinion, you will get two different answers. And we had 30 people in our workshop. And both Kofi Annan and Walter Fust were right. We concluded that international law does not properly protect climate displaced persons and that there are multiple opinions on what to do about it. So we were agreed on several points, but there were some divergences. There was a divergence of views on whether we should now put time and energy into a new treaty. We were introduced to a draft convention on the international status of environmentally displaced persons. Everyone agreed that if there were to be such a treaty, then the focus should be on environmental displacement rather than climate displacement. This is for the now familiar reason that has been explained several times, that it would be difficult to show that the environmental event was directly connected to climate change. And we admitted amongst ourselves that armies of lawyers would be deployed to show that a sudden event, say flooding, drought, hurricane or landslide, was not caused by climate change. And there was a further divergence of views as to whether it made sense to adopt the vocabulary of the refugee regime. For some, the analogy was unhelpful, as the law in the 1951 Geneva Convention did not apply, and there was a risk of diluting the protection accorded to actual refugees today. For others, the situation was seen as analogous, with a wide interpretation of persecution developed during the working group so as to include absence of protection and a failure to provide full enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights. Indeed, some adopted the language of the refugee regime to plead for a system of, quote, provisional non-refoulement, which means one cannot send somebody back to inhumane treatment and a place where there is no protection of your fundamental rights. We were also pointed to the US Immigration and Nationality Act, temporary protection status, which does actually grant status where there has been an environmental disaster. And I think it's fair to say the group felt that all states should be encouraged to adopt similar legislation. Turning to the other difficult issue we were asked to address, disappearing states due to the rising sea level. Here it was clear that the answer was not to be found in the concept of statelessness. That is a concept which relates to lack of nationality, and those inhabitants do have a nationality. And moreover, it was pointed out they have a culture and they have traditions. And the question was posed how to continue that even after the absence of territory. And it was suggested here that we try to be a bit more imaginative as lawyers. And we played with the idea that one might move towards new types of subjects of international law, moving beyond the traditional approach of a state-centric system. But being a conservative bunch, we looked backwards, and all we came up with was the concept of the Order of the Knights of Malta, a people with international rights and privileges. So it solved the problem at the theoretical level, but we failed to solve the problem at the practical level of finding a territory for people to actually live. We then entered a period which became known in what one participant suggested was distressingly creative. It was suggested that we start to think about suing those companies who were generating the effects of climate change, and the apartheid litigation was taken as a possible precedent. At the same time, it was suggested that in some cases, individuals by their actions might be committing acts of persecution, indeed crimes against humanity. And we finished with an examination of the analogy being developed for food refugees and a re-examination of the whole existing refugee regime. So to conclude on the issues on which we were united rather than divided, I think there were three. There are indeed legal gaps to be addressed. In the short term, this means new national legislation, and it means international cooperation on the adaptation plans. In the longer term, a treaty might be useful, at least for some. Second, most of the displacement that we're currently talking about is internal displacement. And in fact, the guiding principles on the internally displaced are protective, but only in theory. We recognize they do not work well in practice, and therefore we need human rights for the displaced to be real rather than rhetorical. And as Mrs. Calmy-Ray pointed out on the first day, fundamental human rights need to take precedence. And lastly, we agreed lawyers need to get a bit more creative, even distressingly creative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I don't see how you can say you weren't creative talking about the Order of the Knights of Malta. I think that's a fantastic idea.